Welcome to the Communist Labor Party podcast. Here we feature presentations and educational pieces we feel are important in the fight against capitalism. In this episode, Sophia Burns of RATPAC and Max Morgan of the CLP discuss the strategy of dual power, the process of establishing and networking institutions run directly by workers to take away reliance on capitalism. This audio is taken from a presentation at a regional Red School educational summit the CLP posted in April of 2016.
All right, so we're going to get the shindig started. Are we good? Woo! All right, so the concept of dual power has been developed since the term was originally used. It goes all the way back to Proudhon. Proudhon. No, Lily and I've got a running gag about fucking with people by saying Proudhon differently every time. And other early Marxist theorists, and Lenin used the phrase originally to talk about developing institutions in parallel to the existing state as a method of building revolutionary power to seize state power. We're not using the term in exactly the same way because this was to describe the period of time between the February Revolution when the Tsar was overthrown and the October Revolution when the Bolshevik Party seized power. And there was an interim provisional government that the Bolshevik Party they were having a contest with a provisional government that was already a revolutionary government, well, insurrectionary government. So I mean, we're not having a contest with somebody else who's like trying to consolidate power. We're having a contest with somebody who's sitting on 300 years of consolidated power. So it's not quite the same shindig, but it's the same idea. So basically what dual power means is to establish in duality, that's where the dual elements of state power that are in the control and management of the working class in parallel to the existing bourgeois state. And Lily's going to talk about ways of doing activism that aren't that.
Yeah, so when we say that we build dual power, that doesn't refer to the same kind of activism that most people think of when they hear activism or they hear politics. I'm going to basically explain what conventional activism is and how it works, and then how dual power provides something fundamentally different from that. And I'll also say at the outset, you know, the CLP also engages in conventional activism. We support conventional activism, but as y'all are about to find out, that's not enough. So the way conventional activism works is it's connected with what you could call the disruption concession cycle. So under capitalist society, shit's pretty bad for a whole lot of people, but the risks of going out and, you know, saying we'll organize a union, we'll go on strike, the risks of saying we're going to have this massive march or do civil disobedience or whatever are substantial. You know, you might get hurt by the cops, you might lose your job, and as it is, capitalism and the capitalist government are the only organizational base of power in society. They control everything that we need, and they have the you know, power to enforce their dominance. So when conventional activism happens, it happens in these broad cycles. When things get bad enough that in a massive way, huge numbers of people are willing to take the risk of activism, then, you know, they start to do that. They organize, say it's the 1930s, you organize because of the Great Depression, unemployed councils and unions and so on and so forth, and you start pushing back against the system. And what that pushing back looks like is, so you have things you want more jobs and better jobs and union rights in the 30s. And, the government and the capitalists don't want you to have that. So they're gonna, refuse your demands unless you can disrupt their ability to go about the daily business of society and the economy and the state to the extent that it becomes less worth their while to deny your demands and have the disruption happen than to make a concession and decrease the amount of activism and the amount of disruption that's going on. You can think of it like a strike. The employer doesn't want to give you paid sick leave, but by disrupting their public image, like Steve was talking about yesterday, and disrupting, you're doing the work that they need from you, eventually that fucks their shit up to the point that they will give you at least some of what you want just to make the disruption stop. And that's basically what conventional activism is. Things get really bad, so you have mass political movements that, if they're unsuccessful, they get suppressed without concessions. But if they're successful, they cause enough disruption that the powers that be give them concessions. Then, because life is a little better, for a whole lot of people, it's not worth for them the risk of continuing to engage in activism. So life is kind of okay for a while, and most people stop being political. So, in the 30s, you had, this massive upswing of left-wing political activity. But then by 1950, that had basically subsided. And a lot of that was because with the New Deal, a lot of their demands had been granted. And then, a couple of decades later, in the 60s and 70s, things were getting bad enough again for enough people that there was another upswing in political activity, and people were taking risks, people were making disruptions happen, and so they got some concessions, and by the 80s, most of that political activity had subsided. And I would say that as of maybe around the beginning of 2014, the cycle's gone up again. Things have gotten bad enough for enough people that right now we're a couple of years into one of those upswings in mass politicization. We're at a point where we're seeing, Black Lives Matter and Occupy, so on and so forth, cause a lot of disruption and not winning concessions yet. But if the historical pattern holds, 5 or 6 years, we'll start to see some concessions in order to bring down the level of disruptive activism. Now, from a revolutionary perspective, since the goal of a communist is not, just to improve people's lives within the capitalist system, but to totally replace the capitalist system, not to get concessions from the powers that be, but to make it so that the powers that be are no longer being, that they are not the ones with power anymore. I imagine y'all can see the problem with concession disruption activism, which is that it improves people's lives under the system, but it does so in a way that allows the ruling class to continue in power, and the concessions generally decrease, disruption and activism to the point that, they make some concessions now, and in exchange they get 25 years of doing what they want and chipping away and taking those concessions away. Dual power is fundamentally different from that, in that instead of simply saying we want a better situation, our demands are, improvement in this condition and, better living conditions, get rid of abusive police, so on and so forth. Dual power says, well, yes, we can and should demand these concessions from existing power structures from the existing power base because we need that to live. But what we should also do at the same time is, like Max said, build this network of new institutions, parallel and alternative institutions doing a lot of the same basic necessity stuff that the capitalist power base, however poorly and exploitatively it does it, still does. So that, instead of just getting improvements while leaving the capitalist power base unchallenged effectively, we can build a second power base. And, that means that during future politicization cycles, there will be two options. You won't just have to ask for concessions. You can also say, well, let's go into these dual power institutions that we've built and let's expand them. And let's get what we need through these new institutions. Let's render, capitalist economic activity increasingly unnecessary while building a network of structures that give us, the capacity to exercise power as a class against capitalist structures, against the capitalist class and the capitalist government. So, again, conventional activism has a place and it's very important because, people need it to live, but dual power means building a second structure of power. It's not any particular demand. It's building a new way to, live our lives the way we want. So, yeah, our slogan shouldn't be, win 15 an hour because we deserve 15 an hour. It shouldn't be get union rights recognized so that we can collectively bargain. It should be win 15 an hour, get union rights recognized because we need to survive. But this is survival pending revolution, as the Black Panther slogan went, survival pending revolution. And dual power means building, the structure of a future socialist, a future revolutionary society.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Lily. I broke it. It's possible. No, I was just like warming up. I don't know. So as Lily was saying, the purpose of developing dual power is so that we don't remain in the disruption activism cycle, which not only leaves capitalism intact and the bourgeois state intact, it leaves us in the circumstances of perpetually sinking to the level that even people with no class consciousness will rise up because their basic survival needs aren't being met. It leaves us in a cycle where our basic needs for survival are not being met periodically, and that's unacceptable. We would like to be alive. That's a thing I imagine we all have in common. So the idea of developing dual power institutions is several fold. There are several parallel purposes. It's not we need to provide for our own survival pending revolution. We need to develop our own power base from which we can wage revolution as a verb. Housing collectives, and you get and you have dual power institutions that are counter institutions that are meant to disrupt the existing state, weaken it, or engage in direct conflict with the existing power base. Things like activist collectives, unions, and alternative media distribution mechanisms, and these approaching the conflict from these two directions. It's not far too often when you get the traditional leftist revolutionary strategy. It's always about destroying the old, and destroying the old. We have to burn down the capitalist state. We have to overthrow the capitalist state. But that's not enough by itself. You have to also create a proletarian power base to occupy that space, to replace the functions of the capitalist state. Because I mean, we like to talk a mad game about how shitty everything is, because it is really terrible. It is objectively terrible for us to live in this situation. But the capitalist state does serve functions. It just does not serve them in a way that meets our needs in a satisfactory way. Like when the libertarians go on and on about how, oh, capitalism created your iPhone and capitalism is why you have a house to live in, they're not like totally wrong. The capitalist mode of production does produce the commodities upon which we rely, but it is not an ethical or sustainable way to produce them. So in order to abolish the capitalist mode of production, we have to have another way to get the things we need to survive. We need another source for those goods and services, which is the socialist means of production, or mode of production. But then we have the whole revolutionary praxis to get there. But in the meantime, there are other things that we need. We need a place to stay. We need food to eat, and hopefully access to a fire department. I don't know. House fires are still going to be a thing under socialism, unfortunately. I don't know. I can't make promises about like no house fires under socialism. So in order to replace the bourgeois state, we have to have, at the very least, a loose framework of institutions ready to fulfill some of those day-to-day survival issues, like maintaining transportation, maintaining the electrical grid, keeping the fire trucks driving, and be able to start replacing those services as the capitalist state is eroded. And basic distribution of food, making sure that crops are planted and farmers are taken care of. Little things like that. Soil management would be nice. So the basic idea behind all that is that, in general, the left is focused on overthrowing the existing system, and very little thought or attention is given to replacing that system in a meaningful way. And that's another advantage that comes from the dual power strategy, is that we are building up a revolutionary praxis at the exact same time we're developing our post-insurrectionary revolutionary praxis. Because at the end of the day, what defines a revolution, or what defines an insurrection as its own event, is the seizure of state power. And because the goal is to have state power so that you can use state power to expropriate the means of production and establish socialism and so on and so forth. But there's no reason to wait for the bourgeoisie to lose state power to start developing our own little nugget of state power.
And yeah, what I think this comes back to is capitalism does a really shitty job of, meeting people's needs adequately. Capitalism is really bad at getting food and healthcare and housing and, furniture and books and media and literally anything, that gets made and that you use. It's really bad at distributing those in a good way, but until we at least start to build a better way to distribute them, what are we doing? We're shouting at the mountain and saying we need something else and not working on building something else. Capitalism is a game that's rigged against us, but it's the only game in town. And, conventional left activism involves saying capitalism is a rigged game, oppose the rigged game, but it stops there. What we need to do is say, yeah, oppose the rigged game and come over here. We're building a game that isn't rigged. Come play our game so that we can shut down theirs.
Okay. So the and as far as transitioning to a dual power strategy from a traditional activist strategy is going out into the woods and gathering firewood and burning a campfire to stay warm overnight, which is great, except every night you've got to go gather more firewood. Like, you just got to keep doing this activist cycle over and over and over again, and it's ongoing, it's repetitive, and it's going to keep happening because it doesn't change. All it does is you spend some time warm and then you get cold and you go get more firewood. And you don't ever make any progress from that. There's no development out of that situation. With a dual power strategy, you're keeping some of the wood that you would have burned and using it to start the process of building a cabin. And after a while, you won't have to go out and get firewood every day because you will have a cabin.
All right, so questions, comments? I saw that.
And that was Sophia Burns of RATPAC and Max Morgan of the CLP discussing the strategy of dual power, the process of establishing and networking institutions run directly by workers to take away reliance on capitalism. In the next episode, we feature the Q&A portion of this presentation. If you enjoyed this content, please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast for more revolutionary presentations, commentary, and workshops. This has been the CLP Podcast. Thank you for listening.